The Wyoming prairie stretched endless under an October sky the color of old blood, and Eleanora Hale could taste death in the dust that coated her lips as she drove her wagon toward home. The two mules strained against their traces, pulling water barrels and winter feed that represented her last desperate gamble to keep Thunderhead Ranch alive through another brutal season. At 35, she had already buried one life alongside her husband Thomas 3 years ago. But the nightmares that haunted her sleep whispered that his death might not have been the accident everyone believed. The memory struck like lightning, not of that terrible final morning, but of an evening 2 years earlier when she and Thomas had stood on this same ridge watching the sunset paint their dreams in gold. His arm had been around her waist, his voice warm with possibility, as he pointed across the rolling grassland. "See that line of cottonwoods, Ellie? That's where the Ash River bends east toward our spring box. This land has the best water rights in the territory, reliable flow, year-round access." He'd pulled her closer, his excitement infectious. "We'll build something lasting here. Something our children can inherit, something that'll matter long after we're gone." She'd laughed, then drunk on dreams and the scent of sage. "And what if someone tries to take it from us?" Thomas's expression had grown serious, his jaw setting in the stubborn line she'd learned to recognize. "Walter Sable already tried. Came by last week while you were in town, made an offer for our water rights. 20 cents on the dollar," with a smirk that said he thought I was fool enough to take it. "What did you tell him?" "I told him Thunderhead Ranch isn't for sale at any price. Told him this water belongs to everyone who depends on it, us, the downstream ranchers, even the Lakota camps. No man has the right to own a river." His voice had carried the quiet conviction that made her love him more each day. Sable didn't like that answer much. Said I was being short-sighted, that progress waits for no man. "Progress," she'd scoffed. "Is that what he calls greed now? Men like Sable always dress up their appetites in fancy words. But this land, this water, it's worth fighting for, worth dying for if it comes to that." Now 3 years later, Thomas was dead, and Walter Sable's progress was closing in like a noose. The nightmare that had begun with that rejected offer was about to reach its bloody conclusion. 3 riders emerged from the dust cloud ahead, like harbingers of judgment, their horses foam-flecked and wild-eyed. Even through the swirling grit, she recognized the brand's Walter Sable's stock, which meant Walter Sable's particular brand of trouble. "Mrs. Hale." The lead rider's voice cracked across the prairie like a whip. "Time we discussed your water situation." Her jaw set with steel that 3 years of widowhood and growing suspicion had forged in her soul. Thomas had died for this land, she was certain of it now, and she wouldn't surrender his sacrifice to vultures, no matter how well-dressed or well-connected. She snapped the reins harder, driving toward the gap between 2 riders. The wagon lurched over rough ground barrels, shifting like the weight of her world tilting on its axis. A rifle spoke. Her left mule screamed and stumbled, blood streaming from its neck like a crimson banner. The wagon tilted violently, and she felt herself falling not just from the bench, but from everything Thomas had died to protect. Should have listened when talk was still possible. The voice belonged to Hatchet Harry Pike Sable's enforcer, his scarred face split in a grin that belonged in hell. His lariat sang through air, thick with menace. The rope caught with a jerk that nearly snapped her spine. Eleanora felt herself yanked from safety like a soul torn from salvation, her boots losing purchase as death reached for her with grasping fingers. Thunder cracked from the tall grass, not storm thunder, but the voice of a Winchester rifle speaking justice. Harry's horse reared in terror, the rope going slack just as darkness closed in. Through dust and blurred vision, she saw him, a figure vaulting from a paint Mustang with fluid grace. Tall, lean, perhaps 40 years old, dressed in worn buckskin and a faded cavalry shirt. His angular features bore the unmistakable stamp of the Lakota people, the same warriors who had made Custer's name a curse. Steel flashed as he cut the rope that bound her. Behind the log, He said his English precise, despite an accent that marked him as one the newspapers called savage. Move fast or die here. She didn't argue. The fallen cottonwood offered scant protection, but anything was better than lying exposed. The stranger pressed against the log beside her, counting shots with professional patience. "When I move," he said quietly, "get to that wagon and make those mules run." "I can't." "You can." Dark eyes met hers, carrying the weight of battles survived. "You don't quit, Mrs. Hale. Don't start now." Gunfire paused as Sable's men reloaded. He exploded from cover like controlled lightning, zigzagging toward the wagon while bullets chased his shadow. One found him. She heard his grunt, saw blood darken his shoulder, but he kept running. She ran too, reaching the mules just as he dove onto the driver's bench. Her palm cracked against horseflesh, and the team bolted forward with desperate energy. Behind them, pursuit followed, but their horses were spent and the prairie vast. Within minutes, they'd vanished into a draw, where sage grew thick enough to hide secrets and broken dreams. Only when silence returned did she look at the man who'd saved her life. Blood soaked his shirt, but his hands were steady, his eyes already scanning for the next threat. "You're hurt," she said. "I've been worse." He glanced at her with something almost like amusement. "Your ranch is Thunderhead." "Yes. How?" "The brand on your barrels. And because Walter Sable's been telling anyone who'll listen about the stubborn widow who won't see reason." The words hung between them like smoke, heavy with implications that would change everything. As they rattled toward home through gathering darkness, one truth crystallized: the war for Thomas's legacy had begun in earnest, and she was no longer fighting it alone. 2 miles downstream from Thunderhead Ranch, where the Ash River curved through a natural meadow sheltered by ancient cottonwoods, the remnants of Wakiza's people had made their temporary camp. It was a modest settlement. 6 lodges arranged in the traditional circle with cooking fires sending thin streams of smoke into the evening air. The horses grazed nearby, their paint and pinto markings blending with the shadows cast by the setting sun. Winona sat cross-legged beside the central fire, her nimble fingers working sinew through holes in a piece of doe skin, while her cousin Wakiza stared into the flames with the brooding intensity that had marked him since his return from the white woman's ranch. Around them, the sounds of camp life continued: children playing games with willow hoops, elders sharing quiet conversations, the soft voices of women preparing the evening meal. "You've been thinking about the water thieves," Winona said without looking up from her work. It wasn't a question. "The flow at our bathing pool dropped again today." Wakiza replied, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated worry. "3rd time this month. Soon there won't be enough left for drinking." "And you believe the white rancher woman is not responsible?" Wakiza was quiet for a long moment, remembering the determination in Eleanor Hale's green eyes, the way she'd faced death without flinching. "I've seen greed, cousin. I've seen what happens when white men decide they want something that belongs to others. This is different." An old man named Grey Wolf looked up from sharpening his knife. His weathered face creased with concern. "The Wasiku have never shown respect for water or land that feeds all creatures. Why should this one be different? Because she fights like someone protecting sacred ground, not someone seeking profit." Wakiza stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the darkening sky. "And because the real enemy is the one who sends riders with ropes and guns." Winona set aside her sewing and studied her cousin's face in the firelight. She had known him since childhood, had watched him struggle with the impossible choice between his people's traditional ways and the harsh realities of a world increasingly dominated by white expansion. His 3 years as an army scout had left scars that went deeper than the bullet wounds on his body. "Tell me about Fort Robinson," she said quietly. "About why you stopped believing in their promises." Wakiza's expression darkened, but he didn't shy away from the painful memory. "Colonel Bradley sent me to guide a supply column to a trading post on the Platte. said it was routine, just keeping the peace between settlers and tribes. But when we got there, I found out the supplies were repeating rifles meant for a militia that was planning to attack a peaceful Cheyenne village. He paused, poking at the fire again. I tried to warn the Cheyenne, but I was too late. 23 people died, including 7 children. The colonel called it a preventive action and gave me a commendation for my service. That's when you left the army. That's when I learned that honor and duty mean different things to different people. The colonel thought he was protecting settlers. The militia thought they were defending their families. But the children who died, they were just children playing by a stream that had run clear for 1,000 years. Gray Wolf grunted approval. The Wassaku speak of law and justice, but their laws only protect their own people. Their justice only flows in one direction. Perhaps, Wakiza said thoughtfully. But I've met one who might be different. One who seems to understand that water belongs to all living things, not just those with the power to claim it. Winona studied her cousin's face, reading meanings that went deeper than his words. You mean to help her? I mean to help everyone who depends on this river. If that includes the Hale woman, then we work together. If she proves false... He left the threat unspoken, but his hand moved instinctively to his knife handle. A child's laughter drifted across the camp as a young boy chased a grasshopper through the grass, his movements quick and joyful, despite the uncertainty that shadowed their lives. Watching him, Winona felt the familiar ache of responsibility for her people's survival, in a world that seemed determined to erase them from existence. The flow continues to drop, she said quietly. Even if this white woman is not our enemy, someone is stealing our life away drop by drop. And then we find out who. Wakiza replied, his voice carrying the finality of a war chief making battle plans. And we stop them. As the stars emerged overhead and the camp settled into evening quiet, neither of them could have imagined how soon those words would be tested, or how much their alliance with a desperate widow would change the fate of everyone who called the Ash River Valley home. Thunderhead Ranch sat under the star-drunk sky like a fortress of memories, its buildings arranged with military precision around the main house. Thomas had planned it, defensible, practical, built to last. Every board represented hours of his labor days, of his dreams, the weight of loans now pressing on her shoulders. In the cookhouse, she watched her savior stitch his wound, with hands that never trembled. The bullet had carved a furrow across his shoulder, painful but not dangerous, barring infection. Name's Wakiza, he said without looking up from his needlework. Means desperate fighter in Lakota. And you fight for strangers. The Ash River don't recognize property lines, Mrs. Hale. When your water fails, everyone downstream feels it. My cousin Winona camps at Shadow Lake with what's left of our people. We trade horses, take day work when we find it. Your spring feeds all of us. She studied his face in lamplight, seeing intelligence, and something else, weariness, that came from walking between two worlds. The army shirt, scout work back when I believed cooperation might bring peace. His voice carried the weight of disillusion. Learned English learned white man's war, learned the only treaty that matters is written in blood. Through the window, she could see Carl Jensen checking the corrals. Carl had been Thomas's choice for foreman, steady, competent. But something nagged at her about his absence tonight. Your foreman wasn't riding with you, Wakiza observed. Supply run to town. Should have been back hours ago. The excuse felt hollow. Man who manages your business ought to know when you're in danger. The criticism was gentle but pointed. Carl's absence during the attack could be coincidence or something darker. She'd learned to trust her instincts about people. And right now, those instincts screamed warnings. Walter Sable. She said, voicing the name that haunted her thoughts. Sable's got plans for your water. His ore mill at Copper Gulch needs reliable flow, and your spring runs year-round. You know him. Break horses at his stockyard sometimes. For cash. Wakiza's expression darkened. He pays fair for horse work. For everything else, he pays whatever it takes. What he wants now is control of every drop from here to the Green River. The scope of Sable's ambition hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about her ranch, it was about reshaping the territory to serve one man's vision. "They'll call me a traitor now," she said quietly. "A white woman taking help from a Lakota. They called you things before tonight. Now they'll just say them louder." His brutal honesty was strangely comforting. At least with Wakiza, she didn't have to pretend the world was kinder than it was. Carl's lantern had stopped moving. Through the glass, she could see him talking to someone near the barn, a second figure she didn't recognize. The conversation looked heated, full of gestures that spoke of argument. Sable's bought influence throughout the territory. Wakiza continued. "Sheriff Briggs, the water commissioner, half the county court. When legal pressure fails, he'll try other methods. Such as whatever it takes. Men like Sable don't get rich by accepting defeat." Dawn was hours away, but she could feel the weight of decisions that couldn't be postponed. Her water barrels would last perhaps a week. After that, her cattle would start dying. "What would you do?" she asked. Wakiza finished his coffee. Considering her question with the care of a man who'd learned wrong answers could prove fatal. Prove the theft first. Make them show their hand where honest folks can see it. Then decide whether to fight or run. "I don't run from what's mine." Then we prove the theft. That simple "we" changed everything. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't facing disaster alone. Hoofbeats approached Carl, returning his horse lathered despite the cool night. He dismounted with shaking hands. Mrs. Hale heard there was trouble. "Nothing I couldn't handle," she called back, not mentioning her visitor. Let Carl wonder about the extra coffee cup. "Good, I'll post extra guards." But his voice carried a false note, and through the window she watched him pace like a caged animal. Whatever business had kept him in town hadn't brought peace. "Your foreman's carrying secrets," Wakiza observed. She wanted to defend Carl, but doubt had taken root. Too many coincidences, too many convenient absences. He's been with Thunderhead since before Thomas died. Dead men can't collect on loyalty, but living men can still be bought. The truth hit her like winter wind. She'd been coasting on borrowed trust that might not survive real temptation. "If you're right about the theft," she said slowly, "proving it won't be simple. Tracks can be read by those who know where to look. And I know water." He stood testing his bandaged shoulder. Whatever his past with the army, it had taught him to function through pain. "I should leave before Carl starts asking questions." "Where will you go?" "Shadow Lake. My cousin camps there with our people." She reads sign better than any white tracker. The offer hung between them like a bridge across dangerous water. Help if she wanted it, all at the cost of her reputation. "Tomorrow," she decided. "Meet me at the Springbox at noon. If there's theft happening, we'll find proof. And then we discover who in this territory remembers what justice looks like." After he left, she sat alone listening to night sounds. By sunrise, she'd made her choice with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Whatever the cost, she would not surrender Thomas's sacrifice to men who measured water by profit. The fight for Thunderhead Ranch was about to begin in earnest, and heaven help anyone who stood between her and the truth she was finally ready to face. Carl Jensen sat at the back table of the Silver Dollar Saloon, his weathered hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey he couldn't afford, watching the card game that was about to cost him everything he'd spent 45 years building. The saloon occupied the back half of Walter Sable's mercantile building, a deliberate arrangement that allowed Willow Springs' most powerful man to keep close tabs on the vices and weaknesses of the men he might someday need to control. The game had been running for 3 hours, and Carl was down nearly $200 more money than he'd see in 6 months of wages from Thunderhead Ranch. Across the table, Frank Morrison shuffled the deck with the practiced ease of a man who made his living separating fools from their money. while beside him sat Jake Henley and Tom Bradshaw, local ranchers, whose smug expressions suggested they knew something Carl didn't. "Call," Morrison said, laying down 3 queens with a smile that belonged on a snake. "Unless you want to fold and cut your losses, Jensen." Carl stared at his own cards. 2 pair aces and 8s, a good hand under normal circumstances, but not nearly good enough for this table. He'd been chasing his losses for 2 hours, throwing good money after bad, and now he faced the ultimate gambler's choice: fold and admit defeat, or risk everything on one last desperate play. "I'll see your 20, he said, his voice steadier than his hands, "and raise you 50. Morrison's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "You sure about that, Carl? $50 is a lot of money for a working man." Before Carl could respond, a shadow fell across the table as Walter Sable himself approached his expensive suit and polished boots, marking him as a man of substance in a room full of prairie dust and sweat. At 52, Sable had the kind of presence that made other men step aside without conscious thought, not through physical intimidation, but through the quiet confidence of someone who owned half the territory and was actively working to acquire the rest. "Gentlemen," Sable said pleasantly, "I hope you're having an enjoyable evening." The other players murmured polite responses, but Carl felt his stomach twist with sudden dread. In his experience, Walter Sable's personal attention rarely led to anything good for the recipient. "Mr. Jensen," Sable continued, his voice carrying the silk-wrapped steel that had made him rich, "might I have a word with you privately?" It wasn't really a request. Carl nodded to the other players and followed Sable to a corner table where the lamplight barely reached, leaving them in shadows that seemed appropriate for whatever conversation was about to unfold. "I understand you've had some unfortunate luck this evening." Sable began settling into his chair with the languid grace of a well-fed cat. $200, I'm told. That's a considerable sum for a ranch foreman. I can cover it." Carl lied, knowing his bank account held less than $30 and his next wages were 2 weeks away. "Of course you can." Sable agreed with a smile that never reached his eyes. "But it occurs to me that there might be an easier way to settle your obligations, one that benefits us both." Carl's mouth went dry. "What kind of way? Nothing complicated? Nothing that would compromise your loyalty to Mrs. Hale or endanger Thunderhead Ranch?" Sable leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm simply interested in staying informed about developments in the area. Water rights, property disputes, that sort of thing. Information that's practically public knowledge anyway." "You want me to spy on Eleonora?" "Spy is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as neighborly information sharing. For instance, if Mrs. Hale were planning any sudden trips to Cheyenne, or if she had meetings with territorial officials that might be worth knowing about. Nothing more than what any concerned citizen might share." Carl felt the trap closing around him with the inexorable certainty of winter. "And if I refuse?" Sable's smile never wavered, but something cold and reptilian flickered behind his eyes. "Then you'll need to settle your debt through more conventional means. Frank Morrison can be quite insistent when it comes to collecting what's owed him. And if word got around about your gambling problems, well, Mrs. Hale might begin to question whether a man who can't manage his own finances should be trusted with ranch operations." The threat was delivered with such casual politeness that it took Carl a moment to fully grasp its implications. Loss of job, public humiliation, possible physical violence, all wrapped up in the pretense of neighborly concern. "What exactly would you want to know?" he heard himself asking, hating the words, even as they left his mouth. "Small things. When Mrs. Hale plans to be away from the ranch, whether she's had any interesting visitors, if she seems to be preparing for any kind of legal action." Sable's tone remained conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "Nothing that could possibly harm her interests, I assure you." Carl stared into his whiskey glass, seeing his own reflection distorted in the amber liquid. He thought of Thomas Hale, who had trusted him completely, who had treated him like family rather than hired help. He thought of Eleonora struggling to hold together a ranch and a dream that seemed to crumble a little more each day. And he thought of the $200 he owed the threats that would follow if he couldn't pay the certainty that his life in Willow Springs would become impossible if Walter Sable decided to make it so. Just information, he said quietly, hating himself with every word. Nothing that would hurt her. Of course not. Sable agreed, reaching into his vest pocket and producing a roll of bills. Consider your debts settled, Mr. Jensen. And consider yourself a valued associate in our little community's ongoing development. As Carl walked home through the dark streets of Willow Springs, Walter Sable's money burning like fire in his pocket, he told himself that he was just buying time. That he would feed Sable useless information, harmless details that couldn't possibly matter. That he would find a way to protect Eleonora while protecting himself. But deep in his heart, in the place where a man kept his most honest thoughts, Carl Jensen knew he had just sold his soul to the devil, and that the price would eventually come due in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The disaster arrived with the morning milk delivered in Jimmy Prescott's breathless voice. The Ash River flow at her spring box had dropped by more than half overnight, leaving her cattle bawling at dry troughs. She stood in the yard, frost crunching under her boots, listening while her world crumbled. This was Sable's answer to last night's defiance, swift, brutal, calculated. Mrs. Hale. Jimmy's voice cracked with concern. Doc Carter sent me to check on you special. Tell Dr. Carter I'm managing, she replied, though the words tasted like ashes. But before Jimmy could leave, she caught his arm gently. Wait. Tell the doctor I said thank you. For sending you, I mean. And tell him. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Tell him if he hears anything interesting around town, anything about water rights or territorial surveys, I'd be grateful for the information. Jimmy nodded seriously, understanding passing between them like a current. Dr. Carter wasn't just the town physician, he was one of the few men in Willow Springs whose integrity couldn't be bought or borrowed. The spring box confirmed her fears. Where yesterday a strong flow had filled the wooden channel, now only a trickle leaked through stones. Her windmill turned uselessly, mocking the reality of drought in land that should have been rich with water. Carl Jensen found her there, staring at the nearly empty channel, with the expression of a woman watching her life drain away. Seasonal drop-off, he said too quickly. Happens every fall. In October, Carl. When the aspen haven't even turned, he shifted uncomfortably, eyes refusing to meet hers. Could be blockage upstream. Beaver Dam, maybe. I could ride up, take a look. You do that. Take a very careful look. Something in her tone made him step back. For the first time since Thomas's death, Eleonora Hale sounded dangerous. The remainder of the morning passed in tense preparation. She checked her rifle-counted ammunition, inventoried the remaining water in her barrels. If Sable wanted a fight, she would give him one. But on her terms, not his. At 11:30, she rode into Willow Springs with a list of supplies and a growing certainty that her social isolation was about to become complete. The general store fell silent when she entered, conversations dying as neighbors who had once smiled and waved now studied their boots or found urgent business elsewhere. Dr. Carter's office occupied the second floor of the Prescott building, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with age and the weight of secrets. She found him examining a patient's infected hand, his weathered face creased with concentration as he cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Hale, he said without looking up. Heard you had some excitement on the Prairie Road yesterday. News travels fast in a small town. Bad news always does. He finished bandaging the patient's hand and sent the man on his way before turning his full attention to her. Jimmy delivered your message. I'm afraid the interesting information isn't particularly encouraging. She waited while he washed his hands in a basin of carbolic solution, noting the way his shoulders tensed with the weight of what he was about to reveal. Walter Sable's been busy, Carter said finally. paid a visit to Judge Blackwood last week, along with some territorial officials I didn't recognize. Legal papers were filed, surveys ordered, that sort of thing. He dried his hands carefully, buying time to organize his thoughts. Word is, he's claiming your water rights are based on fraudulent territorial filings. That's impossible. Thomas had those documents verified in Cheyenne. I know that, and you know that. But Sable's got enough money to make impossible things seem possible, at least on paper. Carter moved to his desk and pulled out a small leather journal, flipping through pages covered with his precise handwriting. I keep detailed records of my patients and their visits. Date, time, nature of treatment, official business, to births, deaths, that sort of thing. What does that have to do with my water rights? Paul Rene, the territorial clerk, claimed he processed your husband's filing on March 15, 1880. But according to my records, Paul spent that entire day here in my office, helping me deliver the Morrison twins. Difficult birth lasted 14 hours. He couldn't have been in the courthouse filing papers. The implication hit her like a physical blow. If the territorial clerk had falsified records about her water rights filing, then Sable's legal challenge might actually succeed, regardless of the truth. Why are you telling me this? Carter closed his journal and met her eyes directly. Because some things matter more than staying out of trouble. Your husband was a good man who treated everyone fairly regardless of their station in life. You're cut from the same cloth. He paused, then added quietly, and because I delivered you when you were born, Eleanora Catherine Morrison, I'll be damned if I'll stand by and watch Walter Sable steal your birthright through lies and corruption. As she left the doctor's office, Eleanora felt the weight of alliance settling on her shoulders alongside the burden of impending conflict. She wasn't completely alone in this fight, not yet. But the forces arrayed against her were more powerful and more systematically corrupt than she had ever imagined. The ride back to Thunderhead gave her time to think, to plan, to prepare for the confrontation that was now inevitable. By the time she reached the spring box where Wakiza waited, she had made her peace with whatever consequences might follow. The war for her husband's legacy was about to begin in earnest, and she intended to fight it with everything she had. By noon, she'd saddled her mare and ridden to the grove, where Wakiza waited with the patience of a man accustomed to life or death timing. Beside him stood a young Lakota woman with intelligent eyes and the stillness of deep waters. My cousin Winona, Wakiza said. She tracks like she was born to it. With them came unexpected support. Deputy Aiden O'Rourke on a distant ridge, his badge catching sunlight. The young lawman was honest enough to risk his career for justice. If we find proof, she said carefully, what then? Then you choose between law and war. They rode upstream along the river's winding course through broken country perfect for concealing theft. 2 miles above her spring in a narrow canyon where walls pressed close, they found their answer. Someone had built a professional diversion stones and brush, creating a dam that fed water into a buried iron pipe, angling toward Copper Gulch, carrying perhaps a third of the river's flow. Please, Wakiza said, holding up a flared tin pipe. Allow me to put the tip into the connection. If flow surges downstream when I break their dam, you'll have proof courts can't ignore. She studied the setup with growing fury. This wasn't cowboys' work. Someone with engineering knowledge had planned this theft. Do it. Wakiza waded into cold water, inserting his siphon tip. Almost immediately, his expression confirmed strong suction, systematic theft, on a scale that could drain her ranch dry. That was when rifles began speaking from the rim rock above. Harry Pike's voice echoed off canyon walls, claim jumpers messing with legitimate development. Bullets chewed stone around them. The situation deteriorated toward lethal violence. When O'Rourke's voice boomed from the ridge, "Drop those weapons! Lawful investigation!" In the confusion, Eleanora grabbed a mud-caked shovel and hurled it at Pike with all her strength. The blade caught him across the face, filling his eyes with mud and sending him staggering backward, cursing. Wakiza tackled one of Pike's companions, sending both crashing into the shallows. The third gunman tried to target Winona, but O'Rourke's Winchester spoke once, sending up a gazer that made him reconsider. While the deputy supervised weapon surrenders, Wakiza returned to the dam. With systematic efficiency, he began tearing away stones and brush. The effect was immediate. As the barrier collapsed, natural flow resumed, with a roar heard for miles. "Proof enough?" Wakiza asked, water streaming from his clothes. She nodded too, overwhelmed to speak. "Proof, yes, but at what cost?" Pike's eyes promised retribution, and Sable wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully. O'Rourke marched his prisoners toward town, but his face was grim, knowing Sheriff Briggs would likely release them before sunset. "What happens now?" Winona asked quietly. "Now we find out who still remembers right from wrong," Eleanora replied. "And prepare for Sable to show his true colors." Deputy Aidan O'Rourke straightened his badge as he approached the sheriff's office, the brass star feeling heavier than usual against his chest. The prisoners he'd taken at the river diversion were secured in the wagon behind him, but he harbored no illusions about their fate once they reached Sheriff Otto Briggs. Still, duty was duty, and some things had to be attempted even when success seemed impossible. The sheriff's office occupied the ground floor of the Willow Springs City Hall, a modest brick building that had once represented law and order, but now served as headquarters for a more selective kind of justice. O'Rourke pushed through the door to find Sheriff Briggs behind his desk, apparently engrossed in paperwork that looked suspiciously like racing forms from the Denver track. "What have you got there, Deputy?" Briggs asked, without looking up his tone, suggesting that whatever O'Rourke had brought him was probably an unwelcome inconvenience. 3 men caught in the act of assaulting Mrs. Hale and her associates during a lawful investigation of water theft. O'Rourke reported keeping his voice neutral, despite the anger building in his chest. Charges include assault with deadly weapons, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Now Briggs did look up, his bloodshot eyes focusing on O'Rourke with the kind of attention a snake might give a potential threat. "Water theft. That's a serious accusation, Deputy. I hope you have solid evidence to back it up. Witnessed the entire incident myself. Mrs. Hale and her associates discovered an illegal diversion that was stealing approximately 1/3 of the Ash River's flow. When they attempted to document the theft, these men opened fire from concealed positions. Mrs. Hale and her associates. Briggs repeated slowly, his voice taking on a mocking tone. Would these associates happen to include any Indians, Deputy? O'Rourke felt his jaw tighten. The race of the witnesses doesn't affect the validity of their testimony, Sheriff. Doesn't it? Briggs leaned back in his chair, a cold smile playing around his lips. In my experience, deputy Indians have a somewhat flexible relationship with the truth, especially when they're trying to stir up trouble between white folks. Are you suggesting I should ignore crimes because the witnesses happen to be Lakota? I'm suggesting you need to be very careful about who you choose to believe and who you choose to antagonize. Briggs stood up slowly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Walter Sable is a respected businessman who's brought considerable prosperity to this territory. Mrs. Hale, on the other hand, is a widow woman who seems to have some very dangerous ideas about property rights and racial equality. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. O'Rourke felt his own hand drift toward his sidearm, though he knew drawing on his superior officer would end his career, even if it didn't end his life. The law is supposed to apply equally to everyone, Sheriff. The law, Briggs said with heavy emphasis, applies to those who respect it and work within its proper boundaries. Mrs. Hale has chosen to ally herself with savages and troublemakers. That tells me everything I need to know about her character and the reliability of her accusations. O'Rourke stared at the man who was supposed to represent justice in Willow Springs, seeing instead a petty tyrant whose badge had been purchased rather than earned. What about the prisoners? Oh, them. Briggs waved dismissively toward the door. I'll need to verify their identities check for outstanding warrants, that sort of thing. might take a day or two. Meanwhile, they'll be released on their own recognizance pending further investigation. They opened fire on civilians during a lawful investigation, according to you, and according to a bunch of Indians whose word wouldn't stand up in any court in the territory. Briggs returned to his desk and picked up his papers, signaling that the conversation was over. I suggest you spend some time thinking about your priorities, Deputy, and about where your loyalties should lie if you want to keep wearing that badge. As O'Rourke left the sheriff's office, his prisoners already being released through the back door, he felt the bitter taste of institutional corruption settling in his mouth like dust. He had taken an oath to serve and protect, but that oath apparently came with unwritten exceptions for those wealthy enough to purchase exemptions. But oaths meant something to Aidan O'Rourke, even when the system that administered them had become rotten to the core. If Sheriff Briggs wouldn't uphold the law, then maybe it was time for someone else to step forward and remind the territory what justice was supposed to look like. The ride back to Thunderhead Ranch gave him time to think, to plan, and to prepare for the choices that lay ahead. By the time he reached Eleanor Hale's property, he had made his decision with the finality of a man who had found his moral compass and intended to follow it regardless of the consequences. Some things were worth risking a badge for. Some fights were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. And some people were worth standing beside even when the whole world seemed arrayed against them. The ride back passed in tense silence. They'd proven the theft beyond doubt, but proving a crime and preventing future ones were different challenges entirely. As sunset painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, she took inventory of her resources against Sable's empire. It would have to be enough, because his next move would be more direct, more brutal. That evening, as they gathered in her kitchen to plan their next moves, Eleonora found herself looking at her unlikely allies with new appreciation. Wakiza sat at her table like he belonged there, his weathered hands steady as he sketched the layout of Sable's diversion in the margins of an old newspaper. Winona examined the flared tin siphon tip with the focused attention of someone who understood that small tools could change the course of great events. "The theft is more extensive than we first thought," Wakiza said, adding details to his rough map. "That iron pipe runs at least 2 miles underground, probably all the way to Copper Gulch. Professional work, the kind that costs serious money. Which means Sable's been planning this for months, maybe years." Eleonora replied, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together in her mind. "The attacks on me, the legal challenges to my water rights, even Thomas's death, it's all part of the same campaign." Winona looked up from her examination of the siphon tip, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You believe your husband's death was not an accident. I'm certain of it now. Thomas was too good a rider, too familiar with that terrain. And the timing was too convenient, right after he'd refused Sable's offer to buy our water rights." Wakiza nodded slowly, understanding the implications. Men like Sable don't accept defeat gracefully. If he couldn't buy what he wanted, he'd find other ways to acquire it. "The question is, what do we do now?" Eleonora asked. "We have proof of the water theft, but with Sheriff Briggs in Sable's pocket, I doubt it will do us much good." Deputy O'Rourke seemed honest, Winona observed. Young, but willing to stand up for what's right. One honest deputy against an entire corrupt system, Wakiza said grimly. Better than nothing, but not nearly enough. They spent the next hour developing their plans, with Wakiza sharing his knowledge of tracking and surveillance, while Eleonora contributed her understanding of the local terrain and water systems. It was during this discussion that she realized something significant was happening. For the first time since Thomas's death, she was part of a team working with people who respected her judgment and valued her contributions. "There's something else we need to consider," she said as they prepared to conclude their planning session. "If we're going to stop Sable permanently, we need to understand the full scope of his operations. The water theft is just one part of a larger scheme." "What do you mean?" Winona asked. "Think about it. Why does his ore mill need so much water? What kind of minerals is he processing? And where is he getting the raw materials? Eleonora stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the dark landscape that held so many secrets. I think Sable's activities go far beyond simple water theft. I think he's planning to transform this entire region to serve his industrial ambitions. Wakiza joined her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring in the gathering darkness. You're talking about systematic resource extraction. Strip mining maybe, or large-scale mineral processing, which would explain why he needs to control the entire watershed. She continued, not just for the water itself, but to prevent anyone from interfering with his operations or documenting the environmental damage. As they discussed these possibilities, none of them could have imagined how prescient their speculation would prove to be, or how much more dangerous Walter Sable's true plans were than anything they had yet discovered. The war for Thunderhead Ranch was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than any of them realized. The retaliation came at dawn 4 days later, swift as a prairie fire. Eleonora woke to gunfire, and Percy Kowalski's voice raised in alarm from the eastern pastures. She grabbed her Winchester and ran for the corrals, bare feet slipping on frost-slick ground. What she found nearly stopped her heart. Someone had methodically cut her fence wire in dozens of places, creating gaps wide enough to drive cattle through. Her prize breeding stock, 20 head of blooded Herefords, worth more than most men earned in lifetimes, were scattered across the range, vulnerable to theft or slaughter. They came before sunrise. Percy shouted, running toward her with blood on his shirt. Cut the wire quiet, then started shooting to spook the herd. How many riders? 8, maybe 10, moving like they knew exactly what they were doing. Carl Jensen's horse pounded into the yard, lathered with sweat. Lost sight of the main herd 2 miles out. He reported breathlessly. They're pushing hard toward Willow Creek, probably planning to mix your stock with Sable's. Classic rustling techniques: scatter the herd mix, then with your own animals claim ignorance when the owner came looking. We ride after them, she decided without hesitation. Every man, every gun. Ma'am. Carl's voice carried warning that made her skin crawl. That's probably what they want. Draw us away, leave everything undefended. The tactical problem was brutal: defend the ranch and lose the cattle, or chase the herd and risk losing everything else. That was when Wakiza materialized from morning shadows, like a ghost given substance. His presence should have shocked her, but she felt only relief. Saw the riders from the high bluffs, he said without preambles. 8 men driving your stock hard toward creek bottoms, but they left 2 behind to watch the ranch. You're certain? Winona's tracking them now. They split off before reaching open ground, circled back through draws. This changed everything. With watchers covering retreat, direct pursuit would walk into ambush. There's another way, Wakiza continued. The old Buffalo Trail through Raven's Nest Canyon. Comes out above Willow Creek, ahead of where they're driving your cattle. Carl's expression darkened. That trail's been washed out for 2 years. Too dangerous. Dangerous for white men's horses. Wakiza replied with subtle emphasis. Indian ponies know that country. The implied criticism was gentle, but unmistakable. Carl's jaw tightened with poorly concealed anger. Mrs. Hale, he said desperately, you can't trust him. This could be some kind of trap. To what, Carl? Her voice cut like a blade. Steal my cattle, someone already beat them to it. Her foreman fell silent, but hostility radiated from him. She could read conflict in his weathered features, loyalty warring with prejudices that ran bone deep. Percy, you stay with the ranch. Carl, you're with me. We take the canyon trail. The buffalo path through Raven's Nest proved treacherous beyond Carl's warnings. What had once been a broad highway worn by countless hooves was now a scramble over loose shale and washouts that could cripple a horse. Wakiza rode point, his paint picking through debris with inherited confidence. Behind him, her mare followed gamely. Carl brought up the rear, muttering about fool errands and Indian tricks. "This is madness," he called during a rest. "Even if we reach Willow Creek ahead of them, what then? 3 against 8. Winona will be there," Wakiza said quietly. "And Deputy O'Rourke, if he received our message. A squaw and a boy with a badge." Carl's contempt was deliberate. "Against Sable's killers." Wakiza's hand moved toward his knife temperature, dropping 10 degrees. Only Eleonora's sharp word prevented violence. But the exchange revealed something troubling. Carl's fear went beyond normal caution, and there was knowledge in his eyes, understanding of exactly what they faced. They reached the canyon rim as sun climbed high enough to burn off morning mist. Below Willow Creek meandered through a broad meadow dotted with golden aspen. Beautiful country, the kind worth fighting for. Wakiza pointed to a dust cloud moving along the creek bottom. "Your cattle may be 15 minutes behind schedule. Where will they cross?" "There." He indicated rocks and deadfall commanding the main ford. Good defensive position, clear fields of fire. She studied terrain with new understanding, learning to see it as he did not pretty countryside, but battlefield where tactical advantages would determine who lived and died. They left horses in a sheltered draw and began descent on foot, moving from cover to cover with infinite patience. Halfway down, Winona met them, her moccasins silent on stone. 8 riders confirmed, she whispered. Positioned as predicted. But there's more, a 9th man watching from the North Ridge. Walter Sable himself most likely come to oversee theft personally. The thought filled her with cold fury. They reached creek bottom as her stolen cattle came into view, heads hanging with exhaustion as they stumbled through shallow water. The battle erupted without warning, muzzle flashes winking from rocks above as her small force achieved complete surprise. Gunfire echoed off canyon walls, punctuated by bawling cattle and screaming horses. Carl fought with unexpected courage from behind a fallen tree. When smoke cleared, 3 of Sable's men lay still. 2 more wounded, the rest fled toward open prairie. Her cattle milled in confusion, but remained safe. Victory came at terrible price. Percy Kowalski lay motionless in the shallows, cut down by a lucky shot. At 20, he'd died defending someone else's dream. Kneeling beside him, she felt something precious die in her own heart. This was the true cost of Sable's greed, not just property, but the lives of young men who deserved decades they'd never see. "Mrs. Hale." Winona's voice carried from the North Ridge. "You need to see this." In the observer's position, she discovered evidence that changed everything. A leather case contained detailed maps of Thunderhead Ranch, plus a letter in Carl's handwriting promising cooperation in exchange for debt forgiveness. Carl's been feeding them information. She said, words tasting like poison. Her foreman stood 30 yards away, shoulders bowed with shame. When she called his name, he looked up with the expression of a man whose secrets had been dragged into daylight. "How long?" 3 months, maybe 4. His voice carried resignation. "I owed more to Sable's gambling house than I could pay in a lifetime." The explanation was almost reasonable. But it didn't change the truth. Carl's betrayal had cost Percy his life. "Get off my land," she said quietly. "If I see you again, I'll kill you." Carl nodded, understanding mercy was more than he deserved. He mounted his horse and rode away, a broken man, carrying the weight of choices that could never be undone. As sun climbed toward noon, she stood beside Willow Creek with her remaining allies. Her cattle grazed peacefully, but her troubles were just beginning. Sable now knew she couldn't be easily intimidated. His next attack would be more direct, more brutal, probably designed to end the conflict permanently. But she also possessed something he didn't know about: evidence of his corruption and witnesses willing to testify. The war was entering its most dangerous phase. But for the first time since Thomas's death, she wasn't facing it alone. 3 days after the battle at Willow Creek, when the first shock of Percy's death had settled into a dull ache that would never fully heal, Eleonora and Wakiza conducted their most dangerous mission yet. The intelligence they'd gathered suggested that Walter Sable's operations at Raven's Nest were entering their final phase, and they needed first-hand reconnaissance before planning any kind of intervention. They left Thunderhead Ranch just after midnight, their horses' hooves muffled with strips of cloth to muffle sound on the rocky terrain. The October night was clear and cold, with stars bright enough to navigate by once their eyes adjusted to the darkness. Behind them, Winona maintained watch over the ranch, her rifle ready for any sign of retaliation from Sable's remaining forces. The ride to Raven's Nest Canyon took them through some of the most challenging terrain in the territory, following deer paths and seasonal creek beds that offered concealment but demanded careful navigation. Wakiza led the way, with the instinctive confidence of someone who had learned to read landscape like other men read books, while Eleonora followed on her sure-footed mare, trusting in his judgment and her own growing familiarity with night operations. "No, we go on foot from here," Wakiza whispered as they reached a grove of twisted pine about half a mile from the canyon rim. Horses make too much noise on shale, and sound carries far in thin air. They secured their mounts and began the final approach, moving like shadows among the rocks and scrub brush. The canyon lay before them, like a wound in the earth, its walls dropping away into darkness that seemed to swallow moonlight. From somewhere in the depths came the sound of running water, but also something else, the distant voices of men working through the night. At the canyon's edge, they bellied down behind a screen of juniper and peered into the abyss. What they saw confirmed their worst fears and added terrifying new dimensions to Sable's conspiracy. Torches and lanterns illuminated the railroad trestle that spanned the canyon's narrowest point, revealing a scene of intense activity that spoke of urgent preparation. Work crews moved with purpose among piles of equipment and supplies, while armed guards maintained vigilant watch from strategic positions. But it was the nature of the work itself that made Eleonora's blood run cold. Wooden crates marked with diamond-shaped warning symbols were being positioned at key points along the trestle's support structure. Even from their distant vantage point, she could recognize the distinctive markings that identified high-grade explosives, enough dynamite to level several city blocks, all of it being carefully placed to bring down the canyon's natural rock formations. "They're not just planning to blow the trestle." She whispered the full scope of Sable's genocidal plan, finally becoming clear. "They're going to bring down the entire canyon wall, create a permanent dam that will flood everything downstream, and make it look like natural disaster," Wakiza added grimly. "Spring snowmelt old wooden structure, too much pressure. No one would question it." They watched in horrified fascination as the work continued, counting guards and noting the positions of key equipment. A supervisor, probably Sable himself, though the distance made positive identification impossible, moved among the workers with the authority of someone personally overseeing a critical operation. But the timer mechanism is there. Wakiza pointed to a wooden box positioned near the trestle's center span. Clockwork detonator probably set for 10 or 15 minutes to allow the operators to reach safety before the explosion. Can it be disabled? Not from here. Would need to reach it directly, and that means getting past at least 8 guards in an area with no cover and only one way in or out. As they prepared to withdraw and report their findings, a new sound reached their ears, the distant rumble of wagon wheels on the canyon road. More supplies arriving, or perhaps reinforcements, for what was clearly the final phase of Sable's operation. The implications were staggering. When that trestle failed, and it would fail, because Walter Sable would personally ensure it, the resulting flood would scour everything downstream from the landscape. Thunderhead Ranch, the Lakota camp at Shadow Lake, Hugh McCrae's homestead, and dozens of other small properties would be swept away in a devastating wall of water and debris, unless someone found a way to stop it. The ride back to Thunderhead passed in grim silence, both of them lost in contemplation of the magnitude of the threat they faced. By the time they reached the ranch, dawn was painting the eastern horizon in shades of rose and gold that seemed mockingly beautiful in contrast to the darkness of their discovery. "We have to warn people," Eleonora said as they unsaddled their horses in the pre-dawn gloom. "Everyone downstream needs to know what's coming." "Warning them won't be enough," Wakiza replied. "Where would they go? How far would they need to travel to escape a flood that size? And who would believe such an incredible story without proof?" She knew he was right. But the alternative, watching helplessly while dozens of innocent families were murdered in their sleep, was unthinkable. "Then we stop it," she said with the finality of a woman who had already lost everything that mattered most and refused to lose anything else. "Whatever it takes, however dangerous, we find a way to prevent that explosion." Against 10 armed guards in a fortified position with only one approach, if that's what it takes. Wakiza studied her face in the growing light, seeing something there that reminded him of the warriors of his own people. The kind of determination that could move mountains or die trying. "Then we'll need help," he said quietly. "More than just the 3 of us. Deputy O'Rourke will stand with us, and maybe others if we can convince them the threat is real." As they walked toward the house where Winona waited with coffee and the comfort of lamplight, neither of them could have imagined how soon their desperate plan would be put to the test, or how high the price of heroism would prove to be. The war for the Ash River watershed was approaching its climax, and only one side would emerge victorious from the final confrontation. The revelation came at midnight, like a thief bearing gifts of terrible knowledge. Eleonora had been sleeping in the abandoned line shack when hoofbeats woke her instantly. 3 years of living alone had trained her to sleep light. Through the grimy window she saw Carl Jensen dismounting in starlight, his shoulders bowed with shame that seemed to age him decades. "Mrs. Hale." His voice carried through thin walls, heavy with desperation. "I know you ordered me gone, but there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything about what happened to Thomas." She dressed quickly, keeping her Winchester ready. Carl had betrayed her once. Trusting him again would be foolishness. But the anguish in his voice suggested information too critical to ignore. 5 minutes, she said, rifle ready but not threatening. "Talk fast and honest." "It wasn't an accident, Mrs. Hale. Thomas's death, it wasn't any prairie dog hole." His hands shook as he pulled out a folded document. "Sable's been planning this for years. He needed your water, but Thomas wouldn't sell. So he arranged for Thomas to have an accident." The words hit her like physical blows. She'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed felt like watching Thomas die all over again. "You knew." "Not at first. Sable told me to check that north pasture the night before, said there might be survey stakes that needed removing. I found what looked like a prairie dog hole, but it was too fresh, too perfectly placed on Thomas's usual route." Carl's voice broke. "I should have warned him, should have filled it in, but Sable said he just wanted to scare Thomas into selling. I never thought you helped murder my husband. I was a fool. Sable had me so deep in debt I couldn't think straight. He said no one would get hurt, just a fall that might break a leg, make Thomas reconsider his stubbornness." Tears streaked down Carl's weathered cheeks. "When they brought Thomas home with his neck broken, I knew I'd helped kill the best man I ever worked for." She stared at him, rage and grief warring in her chest. The truth she'd suspected for 3 years was finally spoken, but it brought no relief, only fresh pain, and a thirst for justice that burned like acid. "There's more," Carl continued, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Sable's not just after your water now. Look at this survey." The paper he handed her was marked with calculations in several hands. But it wasn't just her property mapped, it was the entire Ash River watershed, from mountain snowfields to the Green River confluence 30 miles downstream. He's planning to control the entire river system. She realized, studying the detailed engineering plans. Dams, diversions, railroad spurs, planned settlements. Look at the timeline. Carl said, pointing to dates penciled in margins. Construction begins spring 1883. But there's something else that makes all the rest look humanitarian. She found the reference that made her blood turn to ice. According to engineering consultants, the narrow canyon where an old trestle spanned the river at Raven's Nest represented both opportunity and obstacle. Opportunity because destroying it would create a natural dam. Obstacle because the destruction had to appear accidental. He's planning to blow the trestle during spring melt. She said words feeling like poison. Make it look like natural disaster. Maybe 60 families live downstream, homesteaders, small ranchers, the Lakota camp where your friends stay. He's planning to murder them all, drown them in their sleep so he can own a river. The scope of planned atrocity left her speechless. This wasn't just greed, it was genocide for profit. The sound of approaching horses cut through night air. Carl heard them too, his face going white with terror. He knows I took the survey, sent men to find me. Through the window, she could see riders silhouetted against stars, 6 of them moving with predatory confidence. The back door, she ordered, grabbing coat and rifle. Move quiet. They slipped out as the first rider reached the porch. The line shack sat in skeletal cottonwoods that offered minimal concealment. Mrs. Hale. Harry Pike's voice carried mock courtesy, more threatening than honest curses. Come out peaceful, and maybe nobody gets hurt. They moved through leafless trees like ghosts, Carl's knowledge guiding them toward a wash that offered better cover. Behind them, lamplight flickered as Sable's men began their search. They'll track us at first light, Carl whispered as they reached weathered boulders. Harry's got Ute blood read sign like printed words. Then we don't wait for daylight. Her decision was made before words left her mouth. The evidence was too important to risk in a running battle. Can you make the ride to Cheyenne? Get this to the U.S. Marshal. Carl nodded, understanding the weight of what she asked. What about you? I'm going to Raven's Nest. If Sable's planning to destroy that trestle, I need to see the setup myself. That's suicide. Maybe. But if he's moving explosives, there'll be signs, evidence I can use. They separated at the boulder field, Carl heading east, while she turned north toward rugged canyon country. The ride would take her through difficult terrain, but it offered concealment. Dawn found her in broken country above Raven's Nest, studying the canyon through field glasses. What she saw confirmed worst fears and added terrifying dimensions to Sable's conspiracy. The railroad trestle showed signs of recent work. Fresh timbers, new bolts prepared positions for explosive charges. A professional crew was already on site, men moving with the efficiency of those following detailed plans. But it was the sight of explosive materials that stopped her breath. Wooden crates stacked near the trestle's approach, marked with diamond warnings, identifying high-grade dynamite. Enough explosive power to level city blocks positioned to bring down the canyon's natural formations. When that trestle failed, and it would fail, because Sable would ensure it, the resulting flood would scour everything downstream. Her ranch, the Lakota camp, dozens of small properties swept away in a wall of water and debris, unless she could stop it. The problem seemed insurmountable. The site was guarded by at least 8 armed men. The explosives were in place, needing only detonators. And somewhere in the canyon maze, Walter Sable himself was probably overseeing final phases. She needed help immediately. But first, she had to warn people downstream, give them advance notice before spring snowmelt turned the river into an instrument of mass destruction. As she rode away from the ranch that had been her world, the last of her illusions died quietly. There would be no legal victory, no appeal to justice. Sable had bought or intimidated everyone who mattered. The war for Ash River watershed was becoming a war for survival itself, with no quarter asked or given. And she was running out of time to prevent massacre that would stain the territory's history forever. The trestle at Raven's Nest held the key to everything. If she could destroy those explosives or turn them against Sable's operations, she might save innocent families. But first she had to find allies willing to die for strangers, because that's what it would take to stop Walter Sable's plan to own the river and everyone whose existence depended on its flow. Time was running out like water through a broken dam, and she could hear each precious second ticking away. The final assault on Raven's Nest began before dawn, on a morning when spring snowmelt had turned the peaceful Ash River into a thundering torrent. Frost painted the sage silver, but beneath thin ice earth was already softening with promise of floods that could reshape the landscape forever. Eleonora crouched behind wind-twisted juniper, studying the construction site through powerful field glasses, while her breath misted in sharp air. Below in the canyon, Sable's work crew was making final preparations, positioning explosive charges with methodical precision. Through the lenses, she could count individual sticks of dynamite, enough high-grade explosive to shatter the canyon's rock dam and send a devastating wall of water racing toward everyone she was desperate to protect. The charges were connected by networks of fuses, leading to a central detonator with a mechanical timer. Sable was taking no chances on manual ignition failing. Beside her, Wakiza checked his Winchester with patient thoroughness. His paint horse stood ground-tied nearby, ears pricked forward as it sensed tension radiating from its rider. 10 guards confirmed, he reported quietly. 4 at each end of the trestle, 2 more watching approach routes. Work crew maybe 8 men total. Too many for frontal assault, she observed grimly. Agreed. But they expect trouble from downstream. They're not watching the canyon rim as carefully as they should. Winona materialized from rocks, where she'd been conducting reconnaissance. Deputy O'Rourke is positioned above the eastern approach, she whispered. But there's more. I saw Walter Sable himself down there overseeing the final preparations. The news that their primary target was present changed everything. This wasn't just about stopping the explosion, it was about ending Sable's threat permanently. Once we start shooting, Eleonora said with gravity of a judge pronouncing death sentences, there's no retreat. We're outnumbered 3 to 1, and they have professional killers. None of them moved. They had committed to this course, and backing down now would doom everyone downstream. Explosive charges are connected to a central timer. Wakiza observed, studying the trestle. I can see the mechanism from here. Looks like a 10-minute clockwork device. Once activated, it can't be stopped without reaching the detonator itself. Which means, if they trigger that timer during our attack, we have 10 minutes to reach it, or everyone downstream dies. The tactical situation was even worse than she'd imagined. Not only did they have to fight overwhelming odds, but they'd be racing against time itself. The attack began when one of Sable's sentries spotted O'Rourke's position and raised the alarm. The deputy's rifle cracked in response, and suddenly violence erupted across the canyon like wildfire. From her western position, Eleonora opened fire with her Winchester targeting guards near the explosive charges. But the response was immediate, and devastating rifle fire erupted from positions she hadn't spotted, filling the air with the whine of ricochets and the sharp crack of bullets striking stone. That was when disaster struck. Even as the battle began, she could see one of Sable's men racing toward the central detonator. Before anyone could stop him, his hand slammed down on the activation lever. The mechanical timer began its deadly countdown with an audible tick that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. 10 minutes until the entire canyon came down in a roar of water and death. The timer's activated, she shouted across the chaos of gunfire. 10 minutes. Wakiza and Winona began their perilous descent down the northern canyon wall, moving with desperate speed now that time itself had become their enemy. But concentrated fire from Sable's guards forced them to take cover behind inadequate rocks. From the eastern approach, O'Rourke was pinned down by 2 rifles and couldn't provide effective covering fire. A lucky shot had clipped his shoulder, and blood loss was weakening his aim. Eleonora made a decision that went against every tactical instinct. She broke from cover and began a desperate run down the treacherous slope, drawing fire away from Wakiza and Winona by making herself the most visible target. Bullets whined around her like angry hornets. But she kept running, using every scrap of cover the rocky terrain provided. Behind her, she could hear Wakiza cursing in Lakota as he tried to provide covering fire while continuing his own descent. She reached the canyon floor with minutes to spare, but now faced the most dangerous part of her desperate plan. The detonator box sat in the middle of the trestle, protected by guards who had clear fields of fire in all directions. That was when Walter Sable himself appeared, stepping out from behind a support timber with a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. "Mrs. Eleanora Hale," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos of battle around them. The stubborn widow who just couldn't accept progress. "Walter Sable," she replied, her own rifle trained on his chest. "The murderer who killed my husband for a few inches of water." His face twisted with something that might have been surprise. "So you finally figured that out, did you? Took you long enough. Thomas was just as stubborn as you are, wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't accept a generous offer for his worthless patch of prairie. So you murdered him. I arranged for him to have an accident. There's a difference, though. I suppose it doesn't matter much to the dead." Sable's voice carried a casual cruelty that made her blood run cold. "Your husband's father cost me a fortune 15 years ago, exposed to some business dealings that should have stayed private. I've been waiting ever since for the right moment to balance those scales. You're going to die here today," she said, finger tightening on her trigger. "You're going to die here today." Sable continued his rifle, never wavering. "You and your Indian friends, and that idealistic boy deputy. The explosion will be blamed on unstable old timbers and spring flood pressure. No one will ever know the truth. Carl Jensen made it to Cheyenne," she said, seeing shock flicker across his features. "Federal marshals are already on their way with evidence of your crimes. Even if you kill me, you won't escape justice." For the first time, Walter Sable looked genuinely rattled. His carefully laid plans were unraveling, and he could see his empire of corruption crumbling around him. "And then I'll have to make sure there are no witnesses left to testify," he snarled, raising his rifle toward her heart. But Eleanora had been expecting this moment since the conversation began. As his finger tightened on the trigger, she threw herself sideways behind a timber support, his shot splintering bark where her head had been a split second before. The personal duel became a deadly game of cat and mouse among the trestle support beams, both of them seeking the angle that would end the fight permanently. Around them, the larger battle continued, but the timer's ticking seemed to grow louder with each passing second. 4 minutes remaining. Wakiza had reached the trestle's foundation and was working his way toward the detonator. But 2 of Sable's guards had spotted him and were concentrating their fire on his position. Stone chips flew like deadly rain, keeping him pinned behind inadequate cover. 3 minutes. That was when Carl Jensen appeared at the canyon rim, like an avenging angel, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy, as he picked off Sable's guards one by one. His shots were perfectly placed, each one removing a threat to Wakiza's advance. "Carl," Eleanora shouted in amazement and gratitude. "Couldn't let you face this alone, Mrs. Hale," he called back, working the lever of his rifle with mechanical precision. "Not after what I helped do to Thomas." 2 minutes. Sable, realizing his position was becoming untenable, made a desperate lunge toward the detonator box. If he couldn't escape, he could at least ensure that his genocidal plan succeeded. But Eleanora was ready for him. As he broke cover, she stepped into the open and fired twice, both shots, taking him center mass and spinning him around like a child's top. Walter Sable collapsed beside the trestle support's, blood spreading across his expensive shirt, but his eyes still burned with malevolent purpose. With his last strength, he clawed toward the timer mechanism. 1 minute. Wakiza reached the detonator box just as Sable's fingers touched the clockwork mechanism. The Lakota warrior's knife flashed once, twice, 3 times, severing the intricate web of wires that connected the timer to the explosive charges. The ticking stopped. For a moment, absolute silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the distant sound of the river and the labored breathing of exhausted combatants. Then Winona's voice called out from somewhere among the rocks. "It's over. The charges are disconnected." As the surviving members of Sable's crew threw down their weapons and called for mercy, Eleonora knelt beside the dying man who had destroyed her life and planned to destroy so many others. "It's finished, Sable," she said quietly. "Your empire of corruption dies with you." Walter Sable looked up at her with eyes already glazing over, but managed one final whisper. "You think you've won. But men like me, there's always another." Then his eyes went vacant, and Walter Sable breathed his last beside the river he had tried to steal, and the explosives that should have made him master of an entire territory. But their victory was not without cost. As the immediate danger passed and they began to assess the aftermath, they discovered that Deputy O'Rourke had taken a bullet through the lung during the final exchange of gunfire. Carl Jensen worked frantically to stem the bleeding while Winona rode hard for Dr. Carter. But it was touch and go for several hours before they could be certain the young lawman would survive. The battle for Raven's Nest was over, and with it, the war for the Ash River watershed. But as Eleonora helped tend to the wounded and secure the scene, she understood that this victory had come at a tremendous cost in blood and suffering. Yet the river would flow free, and the families downstream would wake tomorrow to a world where water belonged to those who needed it, rather than those who could afford to steal it. Justice had finally come to Wyoming territory, carried on the wings of courage and watered with the blood of those who chose to stand against tyranny. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne buzzed with electricity when the corruption trials began, though with Walter Sable dead and his organization shattered, the proceedings were more about cleaning up the mess than determining guilt. Eleonora sat in the gallery watching as one by one Sable's co-conspirators were brought to justice. Sheriff Otto Briggs received 15 years for accepting bribes and obstruction of justice. The water commissioner got 10 years for falsifying records. Hatchet Harry Pike wounded but alive from the Raven's Nest. Battle was sentenced to 20 years for attempted murder and conspiracy. But the most surprising testimony came from Carl Jensen, who had indeed made it to Cheyenne with evidence of Sable's crimes. His detailed confession, corroborated by the engineering documents he'd stolen, painted a complete picture of the conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in its genocidal goals. "I helped murder the finest man I ever knew." Carl testified, his voice steady, despite the weight of his admissions. "Thomas Hale died because I was too much of a coward to stand up to Walter Sable's threats. I can't undo that choice, but I can make sure everyone knows the truth about what really happened." Judge Bradford, presiding over the cleanup trials, was thorough in his dispensation of justice. Property seized during the illegal proceedings was returned to its rightful owners. Water rights were restored based on legitimate territorial surveys, and substantial damages were awarded to families who had suffered under Sable's reign of corruption. The most significant revelation came when federal investigators opened Walter Sable's private safe and discovered documents that painted the final, most personal picture of his hatred for the Hale family. Letters dating back 15 years revealed a business dispute between Sable and Thomas's father, a conflict over mineral rights that had ended with the elder Hale exposing Sable's fraudulent claims and costing him a fortune in territorial court. "Walter Sable didn't just want your water," Judge Bradford explained to Eleonora during a private meeting in his chambers. "He wanted revenge against your husband's entire family. Thomas's death was just the beginning of what he planned to do to you. But there was more. Hidden among the correspondence was Thomas's own handwriting, a letter he had apparently been working on the night before his death, addressed to the territorial authorities, and detailing his suspicions about Sable's activities. I fear that Walter Sable means to control the entire watershed through whatever means necessary." Thomas had written, "If something should happen to me, Ellie must know that the danger doesn't end with my death. She will need allies, and protection for Sable will not stop until he owns every drop of water from here to the territorial border." Reading her husband's words, after 3 years of grief and struggle. Eleonora felt a complex mixture of sorrow and vindication. Thomas had known the danger he was in, had tried to prepare for what might come after his death. When the legal proceedings finally concluded, she found herself standing on the courthouse steps with the others who had fought beside her. Carl Jensen looked older, marked by his choices, but somehow cleaner for having finally told the truth. Deputy O'Rourke, now Sheriff O'Rourke, bore his wounded arm in a sling, but carried himself with the quiet pride of a man who had chosen duty over safety. Wakiza and Winona stood slightly apart, as they always did in crowds of white faces, but their presence was acknowledged and respected in a way that would have been impossible before the battle at Raven's Nest. "What happens now?" Winona asked quietly. "Now we go home." Eleonora replied, the word carrying more meaning than she had ever imagined possible. "And we build something better from what remains." Summer returned to the Ash River Valley, like a benediction bringing gentle healing rains and meadows painted gold with wildflowers that stretched toward distant mountains. The water flowed clear and free through channels restored to their natural course, feeding grass that grew knee-deep and cattle that had returned to graze in peace. Thunderhead Ranch bore permanent scars from the long conflict, bullet holes carefully patched in barn walls, fence posts completely replaced after the cutting raid's fresh graves in the family cemetery, where Percy Kowalski and the other fallen rested beneath simple wooden crosses. But the fundamental structure of the operation remained sound, and with the legal restoration of her property and rights, the financial hemorrhaging had finally stopped. Eleonora stood on her front porch in the golden evening light, watching Wakiza work patiently with a young horse in the breaking pen he had constructed near the main corral. His movements were deliberate and economical, teaching rather than dominating earning trust instead of demanding submission through force. The social situation in Willow Springs had evolved in ways she never could have predicted. The town had not only accepted the court's verdict, but had begun to embrace the changes it represented. Dr. Carter had been elected mayor on a platform of honest government and equal justice. The new school teacher, a young woman from back east, had made it clear that all children were welcome in her classroom regardless of race or family background. And gradually, invitations had begun to arrive at Thunderhead Ranch. Not the formal, stilted affairs of the past, but genuine expressions of community acceptance for the woman who had stood up to corruption and won. "Mrs. Hale." Winona's voice carried from the cookhouse where she had been preparing the evening meal. "Supper's ready when you are." The evening meal had evolved into a cherished ritual during the months of recovery and rebuilding. It was a simple arrangement, but it represented something genuinely unprecedented in Wyoming territory. A household where character mattered more than ancestry, where respect was earned through actions rather than inherited through accidents of birth. Carl Jensen joined them that evening, riding out from the small cabin he had built on the edge of Thunderhead's property. His presence was still awkward at times, the weight of his past choices hung heavy between them, but Eleonora had decided that redemption was possible for those genuinely willing to work for it. Sheriff O'Rourke came too, his wounded arm healing well, and his badge carrying newfound respect throughout the territory. He brought news from Cheyenne that the territorial governor was planning to visit next month, wanting to see the ranch that had stood up to Walter Sable's corruption. "What will you tell him?" Wakiza asked with gentle humor. "That we did what anyone would do when their home was threatened," she replied. "We stood our ground and fought for what was right. Not everyone would have made that choice," Carl said quietly. "I know I didn't, at least not at first." After the others had retired for the evening, they stood together in the night air that carried the familiar scents of sage and growing things. The coyotes called to each other across the darkness, their voices weaving a song as old as the land itself. "Any regrets?" she asked, voicing the question that had become their evening ritual. "About the choices we made, no." His voice was certain, carrying the weight of a man who had found his path and intended to walk it to the end. "About the prices we had to pay, some." Good men died in this fight, and that weighs on the soul." She nodded, understanding. Percy's grave would always remind them that justice sometimes came at a cost almost too terrible to bear. "What about you?" he asked in return. "Do you regret the path we chose?" She considered the question carefully, thinking about Thomas and his dreams about the ranch that bore his name and the legacy they had fought to preserve. "I regret that Thomas isn't here to see what we accomplished," she said finally. "He would have been proud of what we built together, all of us working towards something bigger than any of us could achieve alone. And now we continue building. For Thomas, for Percy, for all the people who depend on this water to live and grow and raise their families." On her mantle, the dented tin siphon tip caught the lamplight like a talisman of memory. Such a simple device, just a flared piece of metal designed to read water pressure and detect theft. But in the right hands, at precisely the right moment, it had become an instrument of liberation that changed everything. The next afternoon, as golden light painted the valley in shades of hope and healing, they made their way to the small cemetery where Percy Kowalski rested alongside the other defenders of Thunderhead Ranch. Eleonora knelt beside the simple wooden cross that bore his name, placing a handful of wildflowers on the freshly settled earth. "He was just a boy," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through grass. "Boys become men by choosing what they'll die for," Wakiza replied, standing beside her with his hat in his weathered hands. Percy chose well, even if he didn't live to see the results. Carl Jensen approached slowly, carrying his own burden of guilt and grief. "I've been thinking about what you said at the trial," he said to Eleonora. "About redemption being possible for those willing to work for it." She looked up at him, seeing in his face the genuine remorse that had driven him to risk everything to expose Sable's crimes. "What about it? I'd like to stay if you'll have me. Not as foreman, I know I can never earn that trust back. But as a hand, someone who pulls his weight and tries to make amends for past mistakes." She was quiet for a long moment, studying the man who had betrayed her husband's memory and nearly cost them everything, but who had also found the courage to confess his sins and help bring Walter Sable to justice. Thomas always said that a man's past matters less than what he chooses to do with his future. She said finally, "Stay if you want, Carl. Work hard, stay honest, and help us build something worth protecting." As the sun set over the Ash River Valley, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and purple, they stood together beside the graves of those who had paid the ultimate price for justice. Behind them, the river flowed free and clear, carrying life to a valley where courage had finally found its reward and honor had discovered its true meaning. The water belonged to everyone who needed it, and it would flow that way for generations yet to come.